Thanks for being here. Subscribe to Cheating Stories Best, so you don't miss new stories.
The wife works as a nurse and they have a very interesting patient in the hospital. Is he just like everyone else, or do they have something more? Today's first part of a story with a similar plot. Enjoy watching it. You'll understand quickly, the older black nurse said to the new nurse, but keep in mind that this is not at all like a cardiology department. The younger nurse snorted slightly derisively. All cardiothoracic surgeons believe they are God's gift to the world. Their heads are so big, it's amazing how they manage to find a hat that fits. They both chuckled quietly for a few seconds, sharing internal humor that the medical staff did not typically share with outsiders, especially the doctors, who were both allies and enemies depending on the situation. Neurology is made up of tiny advances, the elderly nurse explained. Doctors rarely make life-changing improvements, especially in chronically ill patients and those with long-term traumatic brain injuries. We call them TB. They entered a small room with a single bed. On a thick folder lying in a basket at the foot of the bed was written Michael Bates, whom they referred to as patient number 13. She let out a quiet, humorless laugh. He was shot in the head. A couple of centimeters to the right and the bullet would have missed, but a couple to the left and he would have died without any options. The younger woman nodded in understanding. It would be better anyway. Keeping such patients alive in the hospital is always very expensive and a huge burden on the family. How long ago? She asked. About a year. They fell silent. Then, two people entered the room. Their voices were not raised, but there was tension in the air. Leading the way was senior neurologist Dr. Carlos Silva, of Spanish or Portuguese descent, with noticeable Middle Eastern influences in his appearance. They all nodded silently to each other. Then both nurses quietly walked away. Please, Mrs. Bates, Dr. Silva began. You work in the pharmaceutical industry, so you are hardly a layman in this. Your husband's vegetative state is unlikely to improve. If he had a brainstem dead, then as he signed up for organ donation, we could at least extract his organs and provide significant help to many people. But this is not the case. He is in a vegetative state and we have done everything we can. We cannot keep him in the hospital or waste time on him when we have so many other patients with better prospects. She shook her head. We only have a month left before he's declared in a persistent vegetative state. If we don't act now, our medical organization will refuse to pay for further interventions, and I'll end up having to place him in a long-term care facility and watch him die. He's wasting away. She wiped her eyes angrily. He's only 46. He still has many years of life ahead of him. He looked at her, wondering if she was just another relative grasping for a straw, demanding that he somehow bypass medicine in search of a miracle. But she was not like that, obviously. She had some idea in mind, probably something that would push the limits of personal or professional ethics. He had known Mrs. Bates for almost a year, since her husband was brought to the hospital with a gunshot wound to the head, apparently the result of a botched car robbery on North Lake Shore Drive. Both Mrs. and Mr. Bates worked for a Swiss biotech company, BioVest, which specialized in oncology pills, and therein lay the other half of the problem. She knew enough to question him, but not enough to know it was a lost cause. He tried again to steer her towards the right decision. Perhaps in reality, there isn't much left. We both know that sooner or later, due to inaction, he will develop deep vein thrombosis, DVT, or even a superficial thrombus, with a high probability of it reaching the heart, lungs, or brain. He noticed how she pursed her lips, but he continued because it needed to be said. If we do not issue a do not resuscitate, DNR, order, then at least, when the time comes, we can remove his organs and allow his death to bring life or help to many others. No, she met his gaze, completely unfazed by his authority and status. Once again, he was forced to reassess Mrs. Bates. Her posture was straight, and her conservative work suit did little to hide her toned body. Added to this was a face that, while not conventionally beautiful, would not have been out of place as a presenter or announcer on any TV channel. But it was the strength of her personality that was both irresistible and, if he dared admit it, damn attractive. She told him firmly, it's not just a word, not just a name, but a whole series of controversial articles in medical publications around the world. Zolpidem is the generic name for conventional sleeping pills from the French pharmaceutical giant Sophia Ventus, which are sold in the US under the brand name Ambien, and in the UK, EU, Australia, and Africa as Stilnox. They were called a miracle pill for patients in a coma and vegetative state, approved as a short-term hypnotic regimen. A group of South African doctors reported its paradoxical effect of achieving awakening in up to 60% of patients in a coma and vegetative state. Unfortunately, the problem is that most patients only manage to remain conscious for the duration of the pill's effect, 3.5 to 4 hours, after which they regress and apparently continue to suffer from problems associated with brain damage, such as mobility difficulties, speaking, memory lapses, and so on, depending on the extent of their brain injury. And then, he asked her what happens when it returns to its previous state after the effect wears off. She didn't flinch. "What if it doesn't work at all?" he asked. "Then we will know that we tried everything," she answered softly but firmly. He was secretly jealous of their relationship. Mrs. Bates was a thorn in his side, pushing him to do better. He thought about his own wife, Andrea, at home, and wondered if she would be just as involved, just as demanding, just as eager to help him in every possible way if he found himself in a similar situation. Bite your tongue, he thought, as a wave of irrational superstition about not thinking about bad things in case they did happen washed over him. For a moment, he forced his thoughts back to the present. As she dug through her bag and handed him a small, clear plastic zippered envelope, as if it were an illegal street substance. 10 milligrams, crushed, she grinned shamelessly. "We can flush it down Michael's NG tube with water." They stirred it in water, drew it into a large syringe without a needle, used to give liquid food and water to the patient through a nasogastric tube, and inserted it into the port system. Suddenly, Dr. Silva found himself desperate for a cup of coffee, but she wouldn't budge. So he pulled a chair next to her and helped her wait. He realized that he was wasting time that could have been spent on other patients, but a sense of devotion and an almost eerie curiosity made him stand rooted to the spot from the very beginning of the operation next to the bed, waiting for any result, if any. Then, it happened. It would be the first time in his memory. He stole a glance at Mrs. Bates. Not being an expert in body language, he could feel her muscles tense, her mouth was pressed into a hard line, her eyes narrowed. She was prepared for the worst possible outcome but hoped for the best. Knowing that the company BioVest, where she worked as a pharmacist, regulated. He tried unsuccessfully to engage her in a conversation about the industry, but she answered in monosyllables, briefly. Her attention was focused solely on the patient, her husband. Every few minutes, she glanced at her Apple Watch, noting the time that had passed. 20 minutes passed, and there was no noticeable change in the patient's condition. 30 dragged on, a painful proof that time is, in fact, inconsistent and changeable. Finally, the critical moment came. But still, nothing. There seemed to be no hope. They waited a little longer. 37 minutes had passed when Mrs. Bates's eyes welled with 2 large tears, and she rummaged in her purse for a tissue. "Mandy," he woke up. She turned around sharply and jumped out of her chair. "What?" His voice was hoarse, his tongue unruly, and his need to swallow was hampered by something, as if he had something stuck in his throat. She rushed to him, crying her eyes out, and kissed his face again and again, as if to atone for his sins. "Are you awake?" she asked, and why not, he thought, looking around. He ended up in some hospital room, the sound of an ECG monitor audible above the bed. She stood up to get a good look at him, and when he turned to follow her, he found something attached to his face. He discovered the nasogastric tube and irrationally tried to grab it, to pull it out, but she grabbed his arm and pushed him away effortlessly. His hand looked like it didn't belong to him at all, a thin, emaciated, pale hand belonging to a 90-year-old man. Alarmed, he tried to sit up, even as the heart monitor beeped and his heart rate skyrocketed. "Lie down, darling, lie down," she carefully persuaded him, and defeated, he gave up trying to sit up. Dr. Silva, standing next to Mandy, gaped in surprise. "Incredible," he said. "Mike, do you understand me?" She looked into his eyes. Yes, he thought, stupid question but with a growing sense of tension. Oh, what, and why is it difficult for him to speak? It seemed like his tongue was not his own, and it was numb as if he had drunk too much Novocaine at the dentist. "You were hurt, my dear," she cried even more, unable to control the emotion that overwhelmed her. You were seriously wounded. What? God, his thoughts were slow and vague, and he was starting to worry. Let me out. I want to go home. He tried to sit up again. It's not worth it, said the Silva when the monitor signed off. Seriously, he wished they had been better prepared, but she had taken him by surprise, and he had not expected this outcome. You were in a vegetative state for over a year, my dear. He seemed to understand the words but had difficulty grasping the meaning of what was said. His sluggish brain aggravated his agitation. He tried again to pull the tube out of his nose, as if it were a chain holding him down. If he succeeds, he can get up and leave. His excitement and confusion increased as his vision began to narrow. He groaned in despair, then a wave like a series of merciless, continuous electric shocks pierced him and his body twisted uncontrollably. He had tonic-clonic seizures. That was the last thing he heard. Opening his eyes, he saw Mandy bending over him. He examined her face and realized that she looked tense and tired, with dark circles under her eyes. Hello, he greeted her hoarsely. She was more confident than last time, but he could not understand how long ago it was. Recently? Yesterday? Michael, my dear, relax. I have so much to tell you, but you have to listen. He nodded in understanding, although the first shoots of anxiety pricked his back like tiny needles. You were shot in the head, Michael, and for almost a year, you didn't react to anything. We injected you with ZPM, and you will be conscious while the effect lasts. Understand? His stunted brain managed to connect all the dots, and he finally nodded in understanding, despite unbidden tears welling up in his eyes. A sense of sad finality threatened to overwhelm him as he realized that he was a dead man who could only be resurrected for as long as the pill lasted, but would eventually begin to shorten his waking time as he became addicted. A devastating sob broke through him. Michael! Michael, look at me, this is important. She forced him to concentrate and come out of his daze. From the realization that his life was over. Your left hemisphere of your brain is damaged. The frontal and occipital lobes are affected, but we won't know how seriously until doctors run cognitive tests. He nodded. He knew enough anatomy to understand the implications. I understand, he slurred, the long words tying his tongue into knots. You also suffer from tonic-clonic seizures. He nodded again, because it was easier than talking. He knew about them. In the old days, they were called grand mal seizures. They start on the damaged side of the brain and then spread to both hemispheres. Dr. De Silva prescribed you Latrian. He nodded again. Good medicine. A relatively new anti-epileptic pill that also turns out to have a mood-stabilizing effect. He looked around, but it seemed she was alone in the room. Today, I'm the only one here, so I can talk to you without upsetting or worrying you. But starting tomorrow, the doctors will want to take tests and examine you. Understand? He nodded sadly in agreement and understanding and reached out his hand to touch her, but she seemed weak and trembling. Sorry, he muttered. You don't deserve this. This phrase sounded even more slurred, but she shook her head and wiped away her tears. We have about 3 or 4 hours, Michael. I need you to use your magnificent brain. If our roles were reversed, what would you do in my place? She pondered her question, her brow furrowed deeply, and he found himself waist-deep in thought, which made his thoughts slow and ponderous. He didn't want to think, he wanted to hug Mandy and feel her press against him, but this was not destined to happen. After a while, his frown disappeared as he focused. Focus, Michael. Focus, she urged. He returned his thoughts to her question. What would he do? He looked at her blankly, and she repeated the question. He thought for a while but got distracted again, childishly wanting to shout at the injustice of it all. Then he wanted to pretend that nothing was happening, but it was. He tried to negotiate with an invisible higher entity that he would become a believer, no, an apostle, if only. But even his damaged brain told him that he had to do something himself or simply give up. Mandy urged him to focus again. He put his thoughts in order and began to collect ideas. At first, they were jumbled and rejected, but eventually, the words and concepts flashed like neon lights, and he could express them. His speech was very slurred, but this is what she heard. Silas Ibn. He stopped, and she urged him to continue. Maximum dose of psilocybin, 2 doses every week for a month. She nodded in understanding. Psilocybin is an unconventional preparation which has been shown to promote the growth of new dendrites and therefore new pathways. Drink plenty of water to maintain hydration and flush the kidneys. His speech was not only slurred but also abrupt, with long, painful pauses. But she understood and repeated his words after him to make sure they were correct. In between, she caressed and stroked him, but mostly repeated the question, since his attention only lasted a few minutes before he forgot about the question. Methylphenidate, not Ritalin, which is too short-acting, is better than Concerta, a pill used to treat some behavioral disorders such as attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, which is long-acting. We'll see if it helps me sleep after the zolpidem wears off. His speech continued to be slurred, but she understood everything. He stopped and thought for a long time. She was afraid that he had fallen into a vegetative state early, but he was slowly turning thoughts in his head, like a person walking through a building for the first time, but not at the same time, first an alternative medicine. His speech became increasingly slurred as he quickly tired. She constantly asked him to repeat himself, and he sometimes forgot within a minute what the previous question or his answer was about. She realized that what he was suggesting, with his foggy brain and slurred speech, was a way of living that was preferable to the alternative. She tried to rid herself of emotions and personal prejudice and look at him objectively from a doctor's point of view. He was still conscious but lost in his own mind, trying to navigate the dead ends and missing pieces of his former reality. But, and this is a big but, there was enough genius left in him to justify all the efforts aimed at returning him. In the following days, she sat with him and talked about daily affairs. He became worried, and his anxiety intensified again when he realized that it was 2017, and in addition to his 11-month vegetative state, he had also lost 3 years of memories. Michael rummaged through his brain in search of the missing time and realized with sudden clarity how you can search for something you don't know exists. He tried to remember the events in chronological order, but this turned out to be almost impossible. He asked Mandy about important events, birthdays, vacations, Thanksgiving, Christmas, New Year. He laughed when he learned that Trump became president. He also didn't know that their son, now 22, was flying around the Caribbean with Cape Airlines. The last thing he remembered was Jason trying to get certified to fly a twin-engine airplane. Mandy showed him photos on her phone of him in his Cape Airlines uniform, in the cockpit next to the plane, etc. She comes to visit as often as she can. Their conversations enlivened his mind and gradually improved his memory, but every time the zolpidem-induced wakefulness ended, his eyes closed, and he fell back into a vegetative state. Within days of first awakening, Dr. Carlos da Silva joined a team of 6 neurologists whose eyes were alight with excitement, as they could almost see their names in the pages of the New England Journal of Medicine and The Lancet, as the case became a clinical trial in its own right. The hospital's ethics committee had approved the use of zolpidem and methylphenidate without a prescription, and the team now hoped to rewrite protocols for the treatment of comas in vegetative states, using Michael as the first test subject in the United States. When Mandy insisted on using psilocybin, she and Dr. Da Silva had a huge fight, to the point where she told him she would transfer Michael to another hospital. The remaining members of the neurological team, who were in their 20s and 30s and had positive attitudes towards alternative treatments, eventually went back to the ethics committee, and psilocybin was approved, albeit reluctantly. Michael took the first dose orally, and Mandy was sitting next to him, holding his hand when the reaction to the medication began. At first, he noticed that some colors became muted while others were intensified to the limit. He soon discovered that this unlocked storehouses of memories, some long forgotten, which in turn triggered a range of emotions. He endured this until the effects wore off, and his wakefulness waned, returning him to a vegetative state. The day after that, cognitive and memory tests began, and gradually his mental abilities began to improve. An hour of physical therapy each day allowed him to sit up in bed for short periods of time. His speech was still slurred, especially when speaking long words and when tired, but he was eventually able to stay awake for 5 hours. Michael told Mandy that they should drink champagne to celebrate. She laughed and said that he couldn't afford to lose any more brain cells, but that she would drink with him later that evening. 1 month after taking psilocybin and zolpidem, they added methylphenidate, and he was awake for 6 hours. Then 6 turned into 8 and finally into 7, and he began to feel as if he was living life to the fullest again, albeit with very long intervals. He worked with a psychologist and speech therapist named Karina Anderson, whom Dr. Da Silva said was considered something of a prodigy and had asked to work on his case. She made him do physical and mental exercises, and after a while, Mandy noticed that the fog in his brain had cleared a little. Unfortunately, it was obvious even to her that Michael was no longer as sharp-minded as before. Bruno Rossi, who was the detective on his case, arrived to question him. The bullet fired at you hit the door frame, splitting in two, with a smaller fragment hitting you in the head. It was a .380 caliber weapon. You're lucky it wasn't a 9mm or .45, otherwise, you wouldn't be here. Unfortunately, there was no match for this bullet in either the local or national database, so we were unable to help. Michael also couldn't help since he did not remember anything about what happened. When physical therapy progressed enough that he could stand, he was introduced to Darius Green, a former military man who was to become his daily tormentor for the next 6 months. Darius was a tough man and made it a point to project the personality and attitude that he thought would suit the patient. "Michael, can I call you Michael?" He continued without waiting for an answer. "I don't care, Michael. You have to understand and believe, I don't care what you feel. I'm only interested in the result." He looked down on him as if he were a sergeant on the parade ground and Michael was a private in boot camp. "I have many patients, and you are just one of many." Another merciless look. "You will push yourself to do more than you thought possible, and when you achieve that, I will push you to do even more." He sat back with an air of inevitability. "I don't deal with quitters. If you don't like it, ask someone else." His tough approach scared but also challenged Michael, and he responded, "See you on the half-marathon track in 6 months," and Darius burst out laughing. 6 weeks later, the pill combination kept him awake for 6 to 8 hours when Mandy arrived with the CEO of a North American company and longtime colleague and friend, Robert Neumann. "Glad to see you alive and on the mend, Michael," his voice filled the small room like warm syrup. "Your position is still unfilled, and your team has done a great job on the dossier on hexamine. Now, there are only a few months left until the application is submitted. The BioVest scientific team has been working on clinical trials of hexamine for quite some time. The trials were all double-blind and randomized to prove efficacy and safety in humans compared to existing treatment protocols, and everything looked good. Mandy did an excellent job putting together the dossier and preparing it for submission." He put his hand on her shoulder, squeezing it gently before rubbing it down her back, making her shiver. Michael's eyes widened, and she noticed. She looked at Robert and swung his hand off her back with a hit. He ignored her actions with practiced ease and placed his hand on her shoulder again, patting it. "Stop it," she threw his hand away with a slap. "Come on, Michael, let's have 3 more, 2, 1, great. Drink some water, we're done for today." Darius performed a quick visual assessment of his patient. Michael's height is 1.80 m, weight is 59 kilograms, body mass index is 16, weight is insufficient, but muscle recovery is a long, protracted, and painful process. However, the patient demonstrated an extraordinary will to succeed, which in his opinion was rare, especially among civilians. The good news for Michael was that he could now stay awake for about 8 to 10 hours, but when he got tired, he would faint. He became partially deaf in his left ear and was fitted with one of the new, nearly invisible hearing aids. The right leg was dragging, and walking still required concentration since the sense of balance was somewhat impaired. The memory of the last 3 years had disappeared and was unlikely to return. However, the speech therapist said that in a year or so, he would speak almost normally when he had better control of his language. However, at present, he definitely had a lisp and sometimes stuttered as his brain and tongue disagreed. He also partly lost his sense of smell and taste, which led to a loss of appetite, and he had to force himself to eat. The only permanent person in his life besides the medical staff was Mandy. She visited him every day before and after work. On weekends, she coordinated her visits with his waking hours to maximize their time together. She first consulted with Dr. Da Silva, and after a while, primarily with Karina, as the two of them dealt with Michael's sometimes erratic emotional shifts. His lengthy recovery meant Jason was given time off to visit him, and it was heartwarming for father and son to spend time together, allowing them to talk about a future that was lost shortly before. In addition, friends and colleagues had many opportunities to visit him. At first, Michael showed an almost childlike excitement when meeting them, but then, as his thinking became more lucid, he began to dread these visits because they demonstrated that he had lost the ability to delve deeply into the essence of a matter or move from topic to topic with the same ease and fluidity that they demonstrated. He felt stupid, inhibited, and unworthy of them. This led to depression, but just when it seemed his rehabilitation had reached its limit, he reached a milestone that was unexpected and shocking to the medical team. Early that morning, Dr. Da Silva walked into his patient's room during his early rounds, only to find the bed empty. Looking around in confusion, he saw Michael coming out of the bathroom. "How? When did you get up?" he asked. "Just now. I needed to pee." Da Silva collapsed into a chair next to the bed. "But we didn't give you your daily dose of zolpidem." He rubbed his eyes and looked at Michael in surprise. "You woke up on your own." This is incredible, he thought for a second. In fact, this is unthinkable. And so it turned out that Michael Bates, hereafter known to the medical staff as Lazarus, became the first patient in a vegetative state to wake up of his own free will, without further use of the pill. The simple explanation was that his brain had somehow recovered, not to its pre-injury state, but better than anyone could have hoped or believed possible. The clinical study, which was presented and published in NEJM, the New England Journal of Medicine, caused a mild academic furor regarding the pill treatments being used, especially the use of psilocybin. It also attracted the attention of many detractors who claimed that the patient's vegetative state was misdiagnosed. Others argued that, given the clinical results, he would have eventually regained consciousness without medical intervention. But despite differing opinions, the treatment regimen has now been published, and the team of doctors has become in demand at local and international conferences and symposiums, where they presented the case to a rapidly growing group of interested students. By that time, Michael's recovery in the hospital had already ended. His pill therapy consisted of lifelong lamotrigine for seizure control, an SSRI antidepressant that inhibits the reabsorption of serotonin by neurons, thereby increasing its availability as a neurotransmitter, to control a mild bipolar condition known as cyclothymia, developed or worsened by trauma. He also continued taking Concerta to keep his mind active and focused. By then, he could stay awake for about 12 to 14 hours a day, but he invariably tired quickly and needed a 2-hour afternoon siesta if he wanted to make it until 7 in the evening. He thought he was a complete mess, but at least he was getting ready to go home. Jason called and wished him well, apologizing for not being available due to the airline's pilot shortage. When Mandy drove Michael home, he looked like a little boy bubbling with delight. He explored the house and then the garden, looking at photographs of their life together. When she called him over for a light lunch, he thanked her repeatedly for everything she had done for him. She smiled through tears in her eyes, which also amused Michael, and they hugged each other like survivors of a sinking ship sailing in uncharted waters. Despite their happiness and connection with each other, Mandy was secretly worried about the future. Her husband was alive, brought back from the dead in an act of utter desperation on her part, and subsequently, despite suffering brain damage, he essentially became the architect of his own return to a new normal. But she admitted to herself, this is hardly the norm that she remembers. Gone was a man who had an unerring wit and the ability to captivate an entire room with his brilliant mind. His incredible self-confidence, which often bordered on arrogance, also disappeared. Instead, Michael's feelings of love and devotion for her developed, or degenerated, according to Karina Anderson's personal thoughts, into something akin to religious devotion. It was as if she was his goddess, bringing him back from the dead through her divine intervention. This manifested itself in his need to do everything for her. Every morning, he prepared her breakfast and a packed lunch before she left for work, as if making a ritual offering every day. When she came home, he massaged her back, shoulders, and sometimes even her feet, which he had never done before. Sometimes returning from work, she would find him waiting for her on a wooden bench by the porch. This made her both happy and sad at the same time, worrying about his long-term prospects. The only thing she wasn't worried about right now was their financial future, since BioVest had insured them against injury and disability, paying out almost $500,000 on top of all medical and rehabilitation expenses not covered by their medical facility. In the evenings, they always cooked together. He turned on the radio, and together they chopped, shredded, peeled, trimmed, grated, cooked, baked, fried, and boiled, all the activities that make up cooking. Mandy usually had a glass of wine in her hand, and he drank ginger ale, following doctor's orders for a long dry spell ahead of him. He was currently sleeping alone in the guest room because his sleep was interrupted by violent jerks, kicks, spasms, and convulsions that made it dangerous to have him as a bed mate. An oxygen tank, ECG machine, and oxygen saturation monitor were set up in the spare room, connected to an alarm in case he fell back into unconsciousness. "Dance with me," he persuaded her, holding her tightly as they slowly circled around the kitchen to the music of Nina Simone playing on the radio. The smell of the cannelloni in the oven mingled with the remnants of her perfume and hints of her natural scent, teasing his nose and his senses. She kissed him tenderly, and he responded passionately. "It seems to me that your mood is returning to you," she smiled, and they kissed again. He suspected that his lack of virility was a side effect of the SSRIs and perhaps even the anti-epileptic pills, but there was little he could do about it as long as he complied with the treatment. More importantly, Mandy constantly reminded him that what mattered was he was alive. But in the end, this was not enough. Both Karina and Carlos, by this time they were all already calling each other by name, advised us to be patient. "It's too early to stop taking the medication, Michael. I want to be a full-fledged man, for Mandy's sake, for your own sake. I can't remain half a man anymore. It's too early, Michael. Let's give it another 3 months and then reevaluate." They tried to calm him down, but in fact, he had already made up his mind. So he stopped taking the SSRI the next day, deciding to live with a mild bipolar state, which was preferable to his inability to achieve an erection. For the first 4 days, he did not notice any changes, but on the 5th, he woke up realizing that he was dreaming. He tried to remember it. Unknown figures were chasing him down a busy street. People stopped and looked at him, but no one intervened. Suddenly, Mandy caught up with him. "Come back, Mike," and she turned and walked away with a shadowy figure that reminded him of Robert, and he found himself standing without clothes in the middle of the street. This shocked him for 2 reasons. First, it was the first time he remembered having a dream since he awakened. Second, he became aware that something was trying to surface, running in circles beneath his mind and thwarting his attempts to bring it to the surface. Coming off the SSRI changed his sleep patterns, and he woke up that night to the realization that Mandy had come into his bedroom to check on him. He was happy that he woke up. He was about to call out to her, but she had already turned to leave the room, talking on the phone, and something in her voice made him hold back. "That was then, and this is now. Well, I really miss this. I miss you too, but I can't because Michael needs it. That's why I can't. Not now." "Well, yes, a lot of time has passed. Don't ask me about that." She sobbed quietly. "No, Michael needs me." "Yes, I remember." She began to get irritated. It wasn't easy for me either. By then, she had moved into the master bedroom/bathroom, and he could no longer hear her, but he heard enough to trigger a repressed memory of the first days of awakening from his vegetative state. When Robert came to visit him, he placed his hand on Mandy's back and ran it down her spine. She brushed him off, not because it was unwanted or even unexpected, but because she felt embarrassed by his behavior in front of her husband. He lay awake in bed for some time before sleep took possession of him again. "You seem thoughtful this morning," she said when they sat down to breakfast. "I have something to think about," he answered evasively. "Is it because of the half marathon this weekend?" Her eyes sparkled, and he wanted to pounce on her. How could she be so two-faced? Or maybe that's what she is. Maybe I'm just paranoid. Maybe it was his damaged brain that couldn't properly process what he heard. He suppressed the urge to shout something, realizing that the first thing he needed to do was take control of his life rather than become confrontational. "I promised Darius that I would compete with him for money this weekend, and I just hope that I can at least reach the finish line, let alone keep up with him." He turned away and hobbled up the stairs with his unusual gait, caused by his lazy leg. She finished her coffee, lost in thought, and went to work with a bad feeling. Her intuition told her that he had become distant and that the love, no, not just love, but almost the worship, that he had showered on her in recent months had not only dissipated but seemed to completely disappear overnight. She wondered what could have caused this and remembered her phone conversation the night before. Could he hear her? This seemed unlikely since he had been asleep for a long time, but still, inside the house, Michael acted decisively, completely focused on the task at hand. He looked at their home laptop, nothing. A home landline phone, also nothing. He looked into what used to be their bedroom, nothing. He rummaged through her wardrobe and, at first, didn't find anything either, but after rummaging through the drawers, he made several disturbing discoveries. The first of these were 3 pairs of expensive underwear consisting of bra and thong sets, which surprised him, almost shocked him. In fact, he racked his brains but couldn't remember ever seeing his wife wear anything like that. Although she was well-built and looked younger than her age, which made her attractive, she had never been overtly intimate, and her underwear, still, or at least from what he remembered, reflected her conservative and functional nature. He cursed himself in what he sometimes angrily called his Swiss cheese brain because it was full of holes. The second find was a pack of latex contraceptives. He had a vasectomy a long time ago because she was not responding well to the birth control pill. He tried to rationally comprehend his findings. Perhaps over the years, they had tried prettier lingerie to spice up their nightlife, which, if he dared admit it, had been mostly routine and at times not even inspiring. But this did not explain the presence of latex contraceptives. Well, he thought with a sinking feeling in his stomach, there are probably a number of fairly rational explanations, but I can't come up with any. He noticed her rather well-worn document case, often called a briefcase, and looked inside. It was almost empty except for a few pieces of unrelated paper, office correspondence, and an empty envelope with her name on it. On impulse, he opened it. Almost imperceptibly stuck inside was a torn piece of paper with the inscription "Dissolution of Marriage." The rest was missing. He felt dizzy, pressed his back against the wall, and slid down, almost paralyzed by the numbness that washed over him like a wave. His whole body seemed boneless, unable to support his weight, but his muscles were tense, and he wanted to hurt someone or something. This someone has a name. Her name is Mandy, but he also knew that he could not expose her, at least for now. He wondered if he should call Jason, but after some thought, even his dull mind told him that this would either put Jason in a situation where he would be forced to lie or take sides in a zero-sum game in which there would be no winners. In the end, he slowly realized this and decided to go it alone. So that's it. The mystery lurked beneath the surface like an iceberg, and the next few days passed in an uneasy calm, like the beginning of the Cold War or the calm before the storm. Mandy, not knowing his state of mind, tried her best to get him to talk about what was bothering him, hoping that it was something small and surmountable, but he stopped all her attempts. She was perceptive enough and familiar enough with his new personality to realize that his anger and resentment were directed at her. While collecting her laundry on Saturday morning, she discovered that someone had rummaged through her underwear drawer and found expensive bras and thongs, as well as contraceptives underneath. She froze in place, realizing all the consequences. She considered her options: ignore, resist, evade. It wouldn't be easy. But before she could make up her mind, Darius picked up Michael, and they headed to Maggie Daly Park to register for the competition the next day. Later, he called. "Then why don't you do it again?" "Because you can't do things in isolation when you're married. Everything you do affects your partner." They finished drinking, and with Liz in his arms, they moved into the bedroom where they made love tenderly and intimately. It wasn't some magical moment. It didn't happen overnight, but it happened. It took over a year before Mark moved back home. It was a holiday, the girls were at home, and they noticed that Mark's things were scattered throughout the house again. "Dad, have you moved?" Kate asked with a huge smile on her face. Liz approached Mark and kissed him passionately. "Yes, he's back where he belongs, thank God," Melanie sighed. "I was starting to lose hope." She turned to her mother and said in a rather firm tone, "Please don't mess up again." Liz's mouth opened in surprise, but Melanie quickly added, "Don't say that, Mom. We supported you this time. I'm not sure I could be so supportive again. Daddy gives you what many men wouldn't give." Don't take it for granted. Liz looked at Mark pleadingly, and he replied, "Girls, we're all human, and we all make mistakes. What happened is in the past. We love you, but I will not tolerate disrespect." Liz hugged him. "I'm a happy woman. I won't forget about it. Life moves on, and the road of life is never straight or smooth." He said that he and Darius would be eating at an Italian restaurant. She made herself a sandwich and tried unsuccessfully to watch TV. They returned at 7:30, and Darius stopped by briefly to say hello. Then he and Michael finally agreed on the next day. By the time Darius left, Michael was getting ready for bed. He pointedly closed the door of his bedroom, and she went to bed. When her heart squeezed icy hand, she considered herself an intelligent and rational woman. But on an emotional level, the thought of losing Michael was too much for her to bear. Not now, not after everything they had gone through to get here. She blinked away unshed tears, thinking that, especially now that she had a new Michael reminiscent of their early days and much nicer than the Michael before the injury. She searched through her recent memories and had to admit to herself that other than not being able to make love, she couldn't remember the last time she had felt so connected to him or the last time he had been so close to her, doing countless little things to show her how much he loved her. She spent a restless night wondering what she needed to do to cope with the situation. On Sunday, she got up before him and prepared a high-carb breakfast and a fruit smoothie. "I'll take you to the marathon. I'd like to be with you at the end," she offered, but his lips pressed into a hard line. "I have already agreed with Darius." He didn't even bother to look at her. She felt him slipping away, but she decided that she would not give up without a fight. After eating breakfast and exchanging only a few words with her, Michael went outside and began a slow, low-energy workout. While observing Mandy's behavior, Darius confirmed his initial verdict that she was guilty. Now, the certainty of this had become a cold, hard tombstone that marked the grave of their marriage. "I'll be waiting for you at the finish line," she shouted when he drove off with Darius, and she went to get ready. "What's happened?" Darius asked, noticing the change in behavior. "Should I talk about this?" he ventured. "Yes, if you want me to drag your sorry fifth place to the finish line," Michael thought for a long time. Besides his late parents and Mandy, perhaps even more than Mandy, Darius had seen him at his worst, in those moments when he cried and was angry at the whole world, at his useless body, and at the injustice of it all. He had witnessed his stumbles, his falls, and his moments of jubilation when he exceeded his own expectations. Darius knew him well. "Mandy is cheating, or cheated on me," he announced sadly, unable to meet his interlocutor's gaze. "Are you sure?" Michael shrugged again bitterly, regretting that he didn't know why, when, and with whom. "Dude, this is cruel. In the army, we called these people Jodies, the ones who seduced the wife of a serving military man." He looked at Michael, who sat hunched over in pain. "Is there hope for reconciliation?" he added finally. Michael looked out the window in complete bewilderment. The fact that he voiced Mandy's betrayal made it much worse. It seemed to harden and become tangible, real. "Hardly," then after thinking, "I don't understand how this is possible." "She saved you, Mike." Darius was not a doctor, but he understood well enough what had happened. "Damn, everyone talked and continues to talk only about this. Maybe she should have just left me." Michael started getting bogged down in self-pity. The spectacle was not a pleasant one, and it did not do him any good. "Come on, Mike, you're not serious." They rode further in silence. At the beginning of the marathon, Michael fluctuated between anger and depression, and stopping antidepressants did not help. When the shot rang out, he grabbed hold of his anger and forced himself to maintain his concentration. Darius ran alongside, urging him on. They agreed to try to run a mile in 9 minutes, with the goal of finishing in less than 2 hours. The first 5 miles were relatively easy, as he had been running that distance in training. From the 5th to the 10th, he had to concentrate on rhythm, raising his knees high so the lazy leg did not drag and stumble. He watched hundreds of runners pass him, a little faster than a brisk pace, and envied them. To Darius's quiet admiration, he remained stoic. But the last 5 miles became a struggle that waxed and waned. Thanks to Darius's encouraging, prodding, and at times demanding focus and pace, with 3 miles left in the race, Michael found himself in a bubble of self-created pain. His body begged him to stop. Instead, he gathered all his determination and, looking at the spectators lining the street, ran from one face to another, imagining that each of them was there only for him, and he was running so as not to disappoint and let them down. Straighten up, keep your head up, don't show pain. They reached the park where the finish line was already visible. Darius stayed close to his weaker side, supporting him in the final meters, as a surge of adrenaline propelled him forward towards the finish. Darius must have informed the announcer about this because suddenly his name was called out. Michael Bates, number 4922, finished in 1 hour and 58 minutes, the announcement read. Let's salute Michael, a traumatic brain injury survivor and son of the Windy City, where he was born and raised. The crowd took notice, and Darius raised Michael's hand with his own in gratitude for the crowd's applause. Over the finish line, Mandy's eyes welled up as she saw Michael's moment of triumph. But before she could get close to him, he was overwhelmed by well-wishers, many of whom had experienced trauma themselves. Some wore prosthetics, mostly below the knee, and there was even a double amputee who completed the 3-mile run. She watched as Michael was carried away by the camaraderie of the other runners and survivors. A cold beer was thrust into his hand. He was about to refuse when Darius pointed out that there was no alcohol in it, so why not? She thought about joining the celebration but already understood that she would be a stranger and, according to Michael, not very welcome. The new Michael had put her on a pedestal, but now he apparently saw her as his fallen idol, a false god. Perhaps he thought she had broken his heart. She didn't know what his reaction would be, but she understood that it would be as strong as the love he gave her, only with the opposite sign. She wiped away her tears and concentrated on not crashing into the car in front of her. What about her heart? What needs to be done to make him understand how much her heart is broken? My Michael slept all Sunday and returned home only on Monday morning. Mandy had already left, which suited him just fine as he still wasn't prepared for the confrontation ahead. But his decision was firm. After a quick morning routine, he began the process of declaring his independence, even if only to himself. At first, his SUV, the same one that was used in the attempted theft, had been sitting in the garage without moving for almost 2 years. He called the AAA, American Automobile Association, to get it started. Inside the car, a lot of work papers, mostly related to clinical trials, were scattered in disarray. He figured they must have spilled out of his laptop bag, which he assumed had been taken during the hijacking. He sighed, looking sadly at the papers. So much of his life had been spent preparing trial protocols and communicating with oncologists around the world to enroll patients in clinical trials. And now, the trials were almost over. The development team led by Mandy got to work and planned to bring the 5-year process to its logical conclusion. He took the papers and began to leaf through them aimlessly, intending to throw them away when he suddenly noticed that someone had highlighted several tables. He was tempted to ignore them, but curiosity got the better of him and he sat down. The highlighted table listed side effects and adverse reactions by pill. The list included headache, dizziness, loss of appetite, and other typical effects that predictably occurred in a large number of reported cases. Approximately in the middle of the table were entries labeled as CA. Their number was relatively high at 22%, and most of them were attributed to hexamine. The entry was highlighted with a neon orange highlighter. A handwritten annotation in what appeared to be his own handwriting directed him to page 64. Flipping through it, he found another table with deaths that occurred during the tests. Their number was at 20%. There was nothing unusual about this. Loss of patience is expected in long-term cancer trials, but this number was higher than expected. We were talking about a test in Nigeria. Looking through other documents, he discovered that the U.S. study also had a large number of events classified as CA and a large number of deaths classified as other. This was also highlighted with a marker. To paraphrase Shakespeare, we can say something is rotten in the Danish kingdom, but what exactly? He walked over to his home computer and tried unsuccessfully to log into the company's main computer. He tried variations of the last password he remembered, but none of them worked. He tried Plan B because after returning, he watched Mandy log in several times and guessed her password, and it worked the second time. He then spent most of the morning reviewing clinical studies being prepared for publication. Most of them turned out exactly as he expected. Hexamine outperformed the 2 pills in comparison and had better survival rates at 12, 18, 24, and 48 months. He went in search of the two trials in question and found them in their final stages, ready for presentation. The results were identical to those on hand, except that the CA adverse events were attributed to one of the older comparator treatments rather than to hexamine. It seems the results have been modified. He tried to log into the raw data files but was denied access with a flashing warning, no permission. After thinking for a few minutes, he decided to go to hell with the doctor's orders and went in search of booze. He found it in the wine cabinet in the form of Glenfiddich 18-year-old single malt whiskey. He poured himself a glass with ice and sat down to consider the consequences. CA was not the typical notation. The C most likely stood for cardiac. He could have been wrong. He hit himself on the forehead with his palm, but nothing. He wanted his brain to work better, but it is what it is, he decided. It could wait until Mandy got home. When she returned, it became clear to even him that she was walking on thin ice. He called her, and she entered the office, looking simultaneously slouched and hunched, as if the whole weight of the world was on her shoulders. "Could you help me with this?" She looked at him wearily. "I just want to know what CA entries are in the reports of side effects and adverse reactions associated with the hexamine trials. Do you want to talk to me about this?" There was surprise and disbelief in her voice, like that of a person expecting a prank or having the rug pulled out from under her feet. "Yes, okay. C refers to cardiac events, mainly cardiomyopathy, and CA refers to cardiac arrest." She frowned. "Why are you asking then?" "It's okay." The records were as he thought they were. "This means that most cardiac arrests led to death," he stated. It wasn't a question. She looked at him for a long time and did not understand what he was driving at, but at the same time, it aroused professional curiosity in her. "Why do you ask? And what test are you studying?" She frowned, trying to remember the details of numerous tests, and he looked at her, wondering how much he could trust her now that she had been exposed as a deceiver and a liar in her personal life. He hesitated, wondering if she was different in her professional life. He was still pondering this dilemma when she leaned towards him, turning over the printouts with the highlighted tables to get a better look at them. "No, this can't be." She turned the pages and looked at what he had noticed. "No, this is wrong." She thought about it. In the final studies ready to be presented, almost all cases of CE and CA were associated with one of the older pills, fluorouracil, commonly called 5-FU. Here they are, mainly related to hexamine. She looked at the bottom of the printed pages and noticed the IDV1. These are original research papers before they have been revised and edited. "Look at this." He showed her the same research on the screen, designated as V4. CA results were now reported for 5-FU rather than hexamine. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that the problem was either in the original or in later versions of the tests, he said. It turns out that either a simple error was corrected or the data was manipulated so that cardiac arrests and subsequent deaths were now classified as 5-FU, Mandy said. "I really want to chalk it up to a bug that had been fixed." Ultimately, the tests passed internal and external review, but the other part of her personality, the professional perfectionist, wanted to be sure. "We need the initial data for confirmation," she said, reassessing his intelligence. Even after suffering a traumatic brain injury from being shot in the head, he instantly recognized a problem that most would probably overlook. She also knew that if anything, she needed to see this through with him. She owed him at least that much. Access to the original data is only possible within the company, she motioned to him. "Let's go." They drove in her Honda, discussing possible reasons for the switch. 5-FU is known for its cardiotoxicity and sudden death, she asked him on the way. "Yes, but its cardiotoxic effects are well documented, and these days, patients are quickly taken off it when it happens," he frowned. She looked at him from the side. He was like the old Michael, has a problem and he won't let it go until he finds a solution. "Did you notice that in the European, Japanese, and Chinese trials, there were almost no heart attacks?" she asked. He frowned even deeper. "Only in Nigerian and North American trials." Once in her office, she logged into the main computer. They worked diligently for a while to get the raw data and eventually sat down and looked at each other. The conclusion was obvious. Hexamine caused acute cardiotoxicity leading to sudden death in more than 30% of African patients, so it was virtually absent from European trials and almost completely absent from Chinese and Japanese trials. To the average person, population differences may seem racist, but medicine and the pharmaceutical industry know that not all pills have the same effects or the same side effects on patients from different ethnic groups, Mandy explained. What's worse is that it's clear that someone manipulated the data to attribute the CE effects to an older pill, 5-FU, Michael said. This is medical fraud of the worst kind. This is worse than the thalidomide crisis of the 50s. At least in that case, the Swiss company Ciba did not test for teratogenicity, the ability to cause defects in the developing fetus, since this was practically not done in the 1950s, which led to the death of many children born with serious defects. However, as bad as it was, at least it was an oversight. This is worse than just bad, Mandy whispered. This is a deliberate falsification of data. They looked at each other in shock. This is cynical, Michael confirmed. Neither of them knew what steps they would take or should take that evening, but they both knew it was a serious matter. The consequences are enormous. Only one question remained: how many people were directly or indirectly involved in scientific fraud? They downloaded the data, and almost half an hour passed before they returned to her car, saving everything on a flash drive, which Michael put in his pocket. The conversation on the way home was unnatural. Both started a sentence and stopped before finishing it or spoke in medical abbreviations. The consequences could possibly sink the company. Additionally, the oncologists who conducted the trials in the US and Nigeria would be involved, meaning their reputations around the world would be ruined. They looked at each other sadly. It was obvious to both that this would not bring anything good for either of them. If they go public, they will both become outcasts. At first, they will be congratulated and scientists will applaud them. But in reality, no pharmaceutical company will ever hire them again, and they will always be viewed with some mistrust. By the time they returned home, Michael was already on the verge of a breakdown due to mental stress, whiskey, in the late hour. He curled up and dozed off in the passenger seat. However, Mandy was not going to leave him in the car. Half supporting him, half carrying him into the house, she laid him down on the sofa. She headed upstairs to find him a pillow. To the sound of banging from below, she went downstairs with a pillow and a light blanket to find two men waiting for her. Michael was unconscious and immobilized. She tried to rush to the phone but was stopped and not allowed to call. She tried to resist, but it was useless. They restrained her and then began to search the house in an orderly manner. They took everything from the home office, including laptops, USB flash drives, and documents. They took her purse, phones, credit cards, and other things, packing everything into travel bags. Mandy realized that the missing things would make it look like they had just left. Soon, they were loaded into a car and driven away. Michael came to, and they found themselves tied up in a dark room. Mandy was nearby. They were in a room without windows, and a bright light was shining into their eyes. The interrogations began. They were not asked if they had spoken to anyone because the kidnappers checked their phones and found that there were no calls. There was only one question left: where's the flash drive? Apparently, during the search, they found printouts but not the flash drive. Mandy lied that they didn't have a flash drive. One of the men began to threaten and put pressure on her, demanding to know where the flash drive was. Michael said they would kill them anyway. The man continued to insist, threatening to harm Michael. Suddenly, Michael had an epileptic attack. Mandy begged for help. After some hesitation, she was released and allowed to help Michael. The kidnappers realized that Michael might know where the flash drive was and decided to wait until he came to his senses. Mandy was tied up again, and Michael was left on the floor. The men left the room to find Michael's medications. Mandy wondered who might be behind the kidnapping. She feared that it might be Robert, the man she had trusted for so long. It seems like the end of the text includes unrelated content about subscribing to a channel and listening to the next story, which I omitted as it didn't seem to fit with the narrative provided. Let me know if you need any further adjustments. What do you think of our first part of the story today? It seems to me that this is just the beginning, and in the second part everything will be clearer and more interesting. What is your impression of the story? Write in the comments. Until new videos.